Hello and welcome to the Week 5 video for the Opus Magnum 2020 tournament. The puzzle for Week 5, Overloaded, has a lot of different inputs and two outputs, a gold and a smoke output made of fire and air. The only way to combine the metals is through purification, so there's the purification pipeline up to gold and then the assembly of all the other pieces into this smoke. And the twist in this puzzle is that it is not in infinite space. It is in a production cabinet. The cabinet has one large chamber in the middle, and then two medium chambers on the left. The connection is from large to the top left, and then top left to bottom left. And then one much smaller cabinet over on the right, which is connected to the main chamber with a length 2 conduit. This is a lot of input to be able to try to place into here. So the question was, is it most efficient to use all of it? Any subset of these reagents is capable of creating both products because each one has some amount of metal, which can eventually, using purification, become gold. And it has some amount of the non-metal, which, given that we have Van Berlo's wheel, calcification, and duplication, means that you can generate this smoke output as well. So the optimal solutions would have to pick which set of the inputs they used and then create some good machine that'll generate these products. The metrics to optimize for this puzzle were cycles for category 1 and instructions for category 2, where instructions is what the game will naturally replace area with when you're in a cabinet puzzle. There's some caveats to instructions, but we'll get to that when we start that part of the video. Let's start first with the cycle solutions. For the first cycle solution we're going to look at is by Chickens in the Attic. Alright, so they filled the whole space roughly. And we can see that the two inputs that they chose to use are the fire with 2 metals and the air with 3 metals. Now this is a very metal-heavy selection, which means that they're more limited in terms of how quickly they can produce the smoke output. And in fact, because there's 1 fire and 1 air per inputs, they have to take each of these inputs 12 times in order to make all 6 of this smoke. So you can see that the process places the gold output in the lower left chamber, which means that any metal has to ultimately pass through this one and clearly purify into gold. So it looks like they have silver will pass through this conduit marked 1, whether taken off of this or purified out from this other input, which has metals in it. And meanwhile, the fire and air are going to accumulate in the center chamber and become smoke in that chamber. Let's see it in action. They are taking all of the iron first and making those into metal in this chamber. Interestingly, I'm just going to watch first the rightmost chamber. The rightmost chamber makes it all the way to gold before it passes anything along. So once it has a gold, does that gold do anything? Or is the solution treating the gold as waste? The solution looks to be treating the gold as waste, actually. So there's this purification chamber over here, which is just the storage of all of the output iron that is not being used. So okay, that tells us that the iron is not being used. They're using the silver and presumably the copper, because there's not enough space to store much more waste than that. Okay, yeah, they pass the copper along. They do a full purification, and then they use 2 extra silvers that they grab off of this to make another output. Okay, so they're making 1 gold out of this input, which is a common trend we will see in other solutions. And then they're making an additional gold every 2 times that they grab this input, while just throwing the iron away using a purification to condense it. Meanwhile, the assembly of this this smoke output, which is the limiting output in the solution, requires 2 of this output be run to get enough air for it. Anyway, you can see here they've dropped 2 of the smoke and the product count is at 8 of 12, and it's only going to increment at this point every time they make the smoke because that's what their solution is slow to make. However, it's functional and it takes 280 cycles. So here, yeah, this shows us an approach. It's not necessarily a fast approach. Up next, we look at MatterMonkey. MatterMonkey, with 159 cycles, has placed all 4 of the inputs. So the attractive reason to place all 4 inputs is that it comes out to exactly make 2 of each output. This one makes 1 gold by itself, as we saw in Chickens in the Attic solution. And then this one, if you take the iron and combine it with this iron, you get a copper. Combine it with this copper, you get a silver. Combine it with this silver, you get a gold. There's 1 gold amidst the other 3 inputs as well. And then you simply just count the atom counts, and there's air, fire, air, fire, air, fire, air, fire. There's 4 air, fire pairs among all the inputs, and that makes 2 of this. So if you place all inputs and it was a free space puzzle, you can assume that that maximum throughput would then be creating 1 of every output every single cycle and dropping it, and it would be an output limited puzzle. The joke being that, oh yeah, this puzzle is output limited is no longer completely accurate. It's not even accurate at all when you have to work in the confines of a production cabinet. So let's see what MatterMonkey does with all of this material. It seems evident that by placing all of these inputs, they're intending to be wasteless. So that means that this iron has to go through the entire purification chain and meet up with this iron. They both meet up in this purification glyph. It becomes a copper, which matches with this copper. Yeah, it ultimately is completely wasteless. They use all the material, 1 of each input per, I'm assuming, per instruction tape loop. And the instruction tape loop goes all the way up until cycle 47, at which point they've dropped 2 of each input, 2 of each output. No, yeah, 2 of each output. Once it kind of loops a little more, the point here of cycle 47, where it starts to go back to the first instruction, doesn't correspond to them having dropped all the outputs. There's still stuff in flight. But we see another choice here, which is going to be a rather common choice, of placing this Y-shaped input in one of these 2 left chambers, so that you can use a nice pivot motif on this unbonder in order to generate all of the output. Oh, and they all actually use the same purification glyph for gold to free up this other purification glyph from needing to handle any of that. So there's gold that's being passed directly out to the output, while the other one is handling this gold. It's kind of amazing how little space these chambers provide when you fill them with all of the inputs first. It's unsurprising to me that the instruction tape was forced to be rather long in any solution that is using all these inputs, because you just don't get the space to move things around. You're kind of nudging things 1 atom at a time, and all of the regrabs required and all of the convoluted paths to get there mean that it takes quite a bit of time. Moving onward, Tweedledee has a 94 cycle solution that also places all 4 inputs. But 3 of them are in the large chamber this time, which gives us a little bit more space to move around. Like, you can start with initial swings or significantly larger motions if you have all the space available, mostly filled with glyphs and outputs that are not going to cause collisions at the very least. They might cause unintended consequences, but they're being avoided very well. So over here on the right, the intention is to assemble fire-air pairs that make it back to this bonder and become a smoke output. The fire-air, which comes out of this input, isn't even passed into the chamber here. It's just stored over here. Meanwhile, a pair of fire is made from this fire and this fire, and a pair of air comes directly out of this. There's 1 more fire-air pair that comes out of... Oh yeah, the air that comes from here matches with the fire without having to go through this. So this has to do 1 pair of fire and 1 pair of air into 2 air-fire pairs per tape loop. And that's entirely within the realm of possibility for this. So yeah, we see that the instruction tape goes up until, let's see, arm 2 is one that starts on cycle 1. It goes until cycle 29. So this is 29 cycles that it takes for everything to loop back to how it started, in which time it has processed 1 of each input and created 2 of each output. So that's a much tighter tape loop than what we saw previously by MatterMonkey, but it is still making the unfortunate design decision of putting every single input on the board first and working around it. And you can see that the only hex of this that isn't used by a glyph, an arm, or an input is this one right here, and it's already being used for storage. This has really squeezed the limits of the space that I made available, And that is amazing to see. It's unfortunately just not as fast as making some trade-offs, dropping fewer of the inputs onto the board, and cutting loop length to be able to use the ones you do place more effectively. Up next, we see Peen-Locket's cycle solution at 91, beating Tweedledee by 3. This one uses the Van Berlo's wheel. So the Van Berlo's wheel is available. That's for any solution that chose not to place all the inputs. They might choose to use the wheel. But it's another giant clunky piece of machinery that will get in the way of all the swings and all the movements that you want to achieve in these small cabinets. So I viewed the Van Berlo's wheel as I'll make it available to you, but it's going to be very bold of you to choose to use it. So props to Peen-Locket for finding an approach that uses it. He also doesn't use this right chamber at all. Places a few equilibrium glyphs for aesthetic, but all the actual work happens in these 3 chambers. We see the common motif already of placing the Y-shaped input such that it can feed this single atom conduit and begin very quickly making gold in these 2 chambers, which leaves this center chamber devoted entirely just to making the smoke. And that's good, because if this input on its own can produce a gold every time it is grabbed, then the rush now is to find an input that can produce a smoke every time it is grabbed. And this is exactly that. There are 4 elemental atoms. You just have to be able to convert this into fire, which it looks like Peen-Locket does with the Van Berlo's wheel. Which means, every time you grab this input, it produces a smoke. Every time you grab this input, it produces a gold. And this input is being grabbed far more often, so the smoke is actually available faster. The limiting reason that this cannot produce gold as quickly as this is producing smoke is the fact that you can only pass an atom through this conduit every 3rd cycle. So you have 3 atoms to pass through, and presumably the air has to be passed through as well. That means this is on a 12 cycle per gold tape, and that's going to fundamentally limit a solution to 12 times 6 plus whatever time it takes to actually do the assembly, so somewhere over 72. Meanwhile, arm 2 here is able to repeat on 4, 8, 9, 10 cycles. So the smoke is being produced every 10th cycle. But due to the conduit being a bottleneck here, the gold is not being produced by this input every 10th cycle. But it is helped out by the addition of copper. The addition of any copper that is used in the smoke creation comes through and speeds up to some effect. And also what happens to the air. The air from this is not going to be part of the smoke outputs. And this is going to be a common problem for a lot of solutions, is that if you're trying to use this to make a gold and this to make a smoke, you have to handle the extra copper and you have to handle the extra air. The copper is being handled in the purification chain and actually becomes meaningful outputs, but there's not enough space around the Van Berlo's wheel to be able to use the air as part of output, so it just kind of piles up. You can see that arm 12 here is handling waste. The instruction period is actually written out until the solution completes. That's an aperiodic solution, and it crashes very shortly afterwards when there's not enough space to keep it running with all the air that they have placed in the way. But at 91 cycles, it is solving the puzzle, and it's showing a more efficient use of input choice. Up next, we have Sevier. Sevier at 81 cycles, another 10 faster, is using the same pair of inputs, but also this 2 fires and an iron. And the fires and an iron is not being used for its material, it's being used instead of the Van Berlo's wheel to convert the extra air from this input into fire. And that's an approach that I really like, is using one of the inputs that you're not going to be consuming regularly just for the fact that it can serve as a catalyst. This could not possibly fit the Van Berlo's wheel and an arm and still be able to do anything meaningful, but it can fit it can fit this elbow shape and just put the fire on the duplicator and nothing else happens. Again, because that's aperiodic, the solution will just run until the instructions are out, so there's going to be some waste, but let's see how it handles it. So how often is this being grabbed? Is it meeting the every 12 cycle bottleneck on this single atom conduit? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. There's 2 lost cycles, so immediately 3, 3, 3, and 2 lost cycles there. Okay, so it's not able to fill the conduit as quickly as maximum throughput would allow, which is why it's even slower than the 72 limit that you might find. But it's still making meaningful use of this extra copper anyway, in the form of an entire gold. Yeah, so it makes an entire gold out of 4 of this input's copper that it just uses ARM6 to speed up this immediately. So it only needs to run this 5 times anyway. So it runs it 5 times with 14 cycles per grabbing this, and it is able to make 6 golds. And then the limiting process might be just how often is it able to grab this input. So let's see what ARM8 is doing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Interesting. Okay, so it's doing this operation 1 cycle faster than it is doing this operation, meaning that these repeats that you see on ARM8 are going 1 faster than the repeats on ARM1 up until it's over. So the true limiting piece of the solution is getting 6 of this output, which takes some 13 cycles each at 78 plus latency. So that's going to be the reason that this solution is 81. And it's not punished for being slightly slower with this because it does use the extra gold that it makes from 4 of these coppers. And then, of course, because it's just throwing the air wherever it can, there's this conduit, there's this ARM7, which is just dropping stuff around. It'll crash after the 6 outputs are made. But that's entirely valid in the solution. So that's a cool approach. I do appreciate that there is a 13 cycle loop and a 14 cycle loop made to coexist by the fact that you can just code until the solution says you're complete. It really looks bad for the instruction count, of course. You're going to have 500 instructions if you do it that way. But looping machines are only a suggestion. They are not a requirement. Up next, we have SGS, 4 cycles faster at 77. Another pair of these 2 inputs, and one more use of the fire and iron, although this seems like it's a legitimate use of the fire and iron. Curious. How often is it grabbing this versus this? So some of these solutions I had not looked at before I got to the video. So ARM1 is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this chamber is in SGS's solution actually running at the every 12 cycle max throughput on the conduit. So this gold maker here is operating at top speed. It does not seem to be using any of the material from the excess on the smoke, though. Yeah, all of the metal that comes out of the middle chamber is completely treated as waste. So the fundamental limit here is the fact that you're only producing 6 gold from this input, and it takes 12 cycles to grab this input. So that's the fundamental limit of 72. However, the air from this input is passed using ARM4 into the 3 arm over here, which is grabbed by ARM6. It's also treated as waste. 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, all 6 air from this process are also treated as waste. Okay, so the metal from these and the air from this are completely treated as waste, and it's only using the fact that there are 3 red and 3 air, red fire, 3 fire and 3 air when you grab this input pair. So you need to grab each of them 4 times to be able to make the 6 outputs here, just using a 3 to 2. So that means they only have to handle 4 of each kind of waste here instead of possibly higher numbers of waste. And it doesn't have to worry about duplication because it has a balanced count of fire and air among the ways that it is choosing to use them to build this output. So yeah, there's a lot of waste that is being built out by this solution, but it is functional and it has a plan, and it looks like it does keep itself at max throughput, even though it, again, codes its way all the way to the end due to the waste handling. Yeah, it gets the smoke done on cycle 75, which means that it still is just limited by the gold. But it's very close. There's only a 3 cycle discrepancy between the last smoke and the last gold, which is a very good thing to shoot for. If you're going to have 2 outputs that are being made kind of asynchronously, only the slower one affects your cycle count. So make sure that the slowest one is not that much slower than the other. Otherwise, you could have been devoting more resources to the slowest one. Anyway, up next is Brother Mojo. under pressure. 71 cycles. So broke the 72 cycle loop. Or the 72 cycle threshold that was made if you were to place the Y-shaped input in this and not use any other metals for gold. But as in a lot of the other solutions, is choosing to use this input for the fact that it has all the metals and this input for the fact that it has all the non-metals. See how it chooses to use them. They're both in the big chamber, which does remove a lot of the restrictions on how quickly you can process things because there aren't conduits serving as an artificial bottleneck. It's also using duplication from this fire onto the air over here, which I like. That prevents you from needing to place another input or a Van Berlo's wheel to be able to create fire, and it prevents you from doing what we just saw SGS do, where you would place a second input just to be able to balance air and fire. Instead, you're using duplication here to allow, and the salt happens pivoting on top of the input glyph, to allow this input to be treated as air, fire, and then the two air fires are being sent over to this chamber where it is assembled into the output. There's also the spare air being sent over to this chamber, and without slowing down the process, it goes over here where arm 12 treats it as waste. So spare coppers are going into arm 11 and spare airs are going into arm 12. So the waste is being handled pretty minimally but very much effectively. And because the waste is handled by something which is periodic and spinning in a circle, there's no need for it to code all the way to the end of the tape. It just actually encodes one instruction period per tape loop, or I get one of each output per tape loop, and it just so happens that it doesn't crash until this thing has spun all the way around and dropped its waste back on the glyph and caused a collision. So that's really nice. The actual tape length is 11 cycles, so it's able to go faster than the 12 cycle throughput bottleneck, but only by one extra cycle. It's making use of only a single purification glyph, which is pretty nice. I'm trying to see which arm is actually setting the limit, and it looks like it's arm 5, which makes sense. Arm 5 is the one that's handling the waste and getting it out of the way. Is there a second arm which is matching it? Yes, arm 1 is matching it with its reset, and so is arm 8 and arm 9. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons this is at 11 and won't improve without a pretty significant redesign. For those who aren't familiar, if you look at all of your arms and see which one of them end their instructions right at this pale line, or if you were to press tab, which don't have any spaces placed after their instruction tapes have completed, those are the arms that are limiting your solution to the current instruction tape length that it has. If you were to make all of the arms which are at the very end shorter, then the end would get to scoot in and your arms would get to repeat faster. You can also artificially lengthen them with the X command, which is the reason the X command exists. But for the purposes of a cycle solution, usually you want the tape length to be shortest as possible. All right, so this is Brother Mojo's at 71, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Next we look at Rolomni. Rolomni got the solution down to 63. So this is a big gap. We have 71, and then all the rest of them are 63 or faster. Still choosing to use this input in this corner. So how are we avoiding the every 12 cycle bottleneck? It's probably through using extra metal coming from other inputs to get gold out through a mechanism other than purifying this input only. So we see the use of a duplication using this fire, and it seems to be on a loop. Interesting, yeah. So the very first fire from this input is used as a duplication seed, and it seems to just stay there, either until the solution is over or until it is removed as a catalyst and used as part of an output, but I don't think that's the case. How many times is this input actually grabbed, though? Because it is also being harvested for its metals. It does look like it's grabbed 3 times, and the 3 fires that come out of that are treated as waste, one of which is just very convenient waste because it serves as a catalyst. Meanwhile, all of the irons, because there's not sufficient resources to devote purification glyphs to iron. Iron is going to be the lowest value. Spending any of your space purifying iron is time spent not actually getting to gold as quickly as you could. So the irons are treated as waste. The coppers from this center are also treated as waste. But the silvers, of course, carrying a lot of value, are worth passing over. You can see arm 14 is doing this into this chamber, where arm 8 will speed up the gold production slightly with the use of the silver. So that's how it avoids needing to use this input 6 times. These silvers help speed up the process. Every other metal is treated as waste because it's not as high value, but if you're only sending one thing over, it's best if that thing is silver. Meanwhile, because of the catalysis just sitting here, the loop for creating the smoke is actually quite fast. And I believe 6 smoke is done, 6 smoke is done here on cycle 57 before the gold is finished. So at 63 cycles, the slow pull is getting those last few gold out to this output. But it very elegantly solves the throughput bottleneck here and doesn't get itself stuck at 72 cycles because it's able to use some other metals. So that's very nice. It is still completely aperiodic and it will crash eventually because of all the waste. Okay. Usually if I press space, you move. Is there something I missed? Oh, he just has an incredibly long extra time here just so that it doesn't immediately crash and he can look at the final product. That's nice. All right, so next is Mr. Puzzle, and Mr. Puzzle was one who, when I announced the tournament, said that he was looking forward to a cabinet puzzle. So we see he performed very well on the cabinet puzzle at 60 cycles. Similar to what we saw from Severe, this input is going to be used for catalyzing only. But quite remarkably, this solution is placing all 4 inputs, similar to the other ones, and yet it's able to get down all the way to 60 cycles, not stuck where the other ones were in the 90 plus range. So I'll just say right away that this is the fastest solution to make use of all 4 of the inputs, even if the use isn't that significant for this one. It doesn't ever actually consume the iron. It doesn't debond anything at all. It just pulls it into place so that it can speed up the catalysis on the 4 element input. The process for creating smoke here is really fast, and it flows well, so it gets out of the way of itself quickly. In fact, I really like that all of these arms are on tracks that allow them to dodge when arm 4 tries to get things up to here. But what does here mean? If it's the left corner of this glyph, then that means copper arrives from here, and it speeds up the purification process to, wow, okay, that's really elegant. I love how the air is kind of in place swapped here. Like, eventually there has to be air pouring out of this, even though it's mostly being scrapped for metals. You can't store air in all of the corners. You have to eventually pass air through this pipe. And it does that, and it does... Oh, I thought it was an in-place swap. There might be an in-place swap eventually. Nope, there's no need to, actually. Interestingly, it doesn't actually come up with too much extra air. There's 1 air, 2 air, 3, 4. But yeah, there's only 4 uses of this input. That's kind of remarkable. I guess because you're using this silver input reasonably fast and you're getting some extra copper out as well, like you're able to get some very good value out of all of the inputs. So it's no longer even considerably a bottleneck here. I'm curious what the limiting reason this solution can't be faster is, and I have to actually study it a little closer to see why. Well, both the last outputs are being dropped on the exact same cycle, so that's also an extremely good indication of what I just said on the last one, of like if you have one that is slower than the other, make sure that you can devote as many resources as you can to it until it isn't the slowest. And now they are both equally fast at 60 cycles, which is very cool. Oh, I completely skipped over my own solution. It's at 68, so if you were thinking like, oh, I'm watching the solution waiting for the host submission, mine is pretty garbage compared to what we've just seen. Like, I am definitely a victim of the 12 cycle bottleneck in this corner, but I did do what we saw some of the other submitters do, of place this input, and I got it down to 68. I use 4 of these copper to speed up the gold production. You can watch the gold is produced in this purification glyph. And I have some waste air that is just dropped into this conduit to get out of the way. But I'm limited by the final smoke because the process that I use to catalyze and then bond them together required that I place a glyph that blocked me from grabbing this input again faster, so I couldn't even use another arm to start the process on this faster. My smoke was too slow. So yeah, that was my solution. I'm sorry that I skipped over it. It's because I'm looking at a version of the spreadsheet that doesn't include my own puzzle. That doesn't include my own score. But yeah, from 68, let's go back to the ones that are way, way better than me. We already watched Rolomni, who had beaten me, and Mr. Puzzle, who had beaten me. Now let's look at Jinyu. Jinyu has 60 cycles as well, but is slightly lower cost than Mr. Puzzle. And I guess I said Mr. Puzzle's was the best that placed all the inputs. Jinyu's does place this input, but mostly just for aesthetic reasons. The only inputs that are consumed are, well, this one's hardly even consumed either. It's used as a catalyst. But that still is useful. It's more than this input is doing, which is just sitting here doing nothing. So similar to what we saw in Brother Mojo's solution, Jinyu's is using this top left chamber for assembling the smoke input, which leaves a lot more space in the large chamber for producing gold. And there still needs to be a lot of shuffling going on and a lot of arms. It's actually kind of bold to place arm 8 in the middle here, not on a track at all, which kind of forces this to appear more as a donut in terms of collisions. There isn't a way to swing things large swings through the middle because arm 8 will get in the way of basically every collision that you would want to do that isn't around the outside like a donut would already permit. Meanwhile, we see the air that is coming out of this is always treated as waste. I don't believe any air from this input is going into an output at any point. Yeah, there are 4 airs that are treated as waste. But the copper from this input is treated as a means of speeding up gold production. And in terms of what is the final output created, they're both dropped in perfect sync. So just like Mr. Puzzle, Jinyu's has the 2 outputs coming from cycle 60 dropped in perfect sync. And those are both the limiting outputs, so it has a very balanced allocation of resources. What it doesn't allocate anything to is this space has no use in this puzzle other than to contain this input and look pretty. But the fact that it's only connected to this by a 1-atom conduit does mean that it's very limited in how much use it can be. If you try to promise too much from this chamber, you end up feeling like this conduit is your bottleneck, and you saw a lot of solutions earlier had that problem. But 2 more to go. So Jinyu was in 3rd place, beating Mr. Puzzle on the cost tiebreak. In 2nd place, we have Fyendir. Fyendir with 56 cycles. Also chose to use just these 2 inputs, but completely filled the middle chamber. Still isn't using the bottom left and is using the top right just for waste. How is it so efficient? Well, let's see what the cycle length, the tape length is. It's every 8 cycles it's going to act with arm 1, and arm 1 over here is responsible for assembling the smoke. Let's see if arm 8, which is the one that's delivering the metal output, is also there. Yeah, arm 8 is also acting every 8 cycles. So this is an every 8 cycle loop. It's coded out to the end probably due to waste handling. But the fact that it's able to grab a new input every 8 cycles is a significant increase in throughput versus some of the other ones. And so given that you're expecting to get 1 output from each of these, that's an output every 8 cycles. Your limit here is 48, which is so much faster than some of the other numbers we've been talking about. But to be able to avoid collisions and do all the meaningful work on an 8-cycle loop is remarkable. It helps to be able to drop off the pairs of fire and air through this conduit as quickly as possible so that they're out of the way of collisions. And then metals also kind of naturally get out of the way of collisions as they purify because what starts as 3 metals becomes 2 and then 1. And yeah, it looks like the coppers from the center are also treated as waste, which means that there's a lot of waste to juggle in this solution. It's remarkable that it's as fast as it is, given that not only is the space going to be taken up by the every 8 cycles, there's a new surge of inputs, but the fact that the waste has to get somewhere, the waste has to get to the outputs. So this is extremely well coordinated by Fyendir. It even rotates onto the other inputs space without having the input show up yet. It's managing to use input suppression for speed, which is... that's some tech. That is some very cool tech that I think is... it's worth studying. Solutions like this that are able to do this much in such a small space are exactly what I was hoping to see on the cycle side of this puzzle. So very good job, Fiondeer. 56 cycles. And then the winner, faster still, Pentapig with 50 cycles. Now Pentapig is using the same input here in the bottom corner. Every third cycle is going to use the conduit, except for it does manage to avoid putting the air through the conduit using arm 14, which arm 14 just exists to reset the air that this double arm is moving when it drops the copper onto this glyph. But so if it's not concerned about a throughput bottleneck here, that means that it's using some metals from elsewhere on the board. And you can see that there's this input that has a silver, which means that you're kind of forced into using an iron as well. And the iron is the problem. But there's enough space to store 2 iron. And that's all that is. So this input is only used twice. It's used to speed up by a single gold. It does bring 2 new fires onto the board. The first one of which is treated as waste. Second one of which is also treated as waste. Oh, but the first waste is actually reused at the very end to speed up. Interesting. So this puzzle is reusing fire and air from these two to speed up the smoke output. And that's something that not even Fiondeer's solution that we just looked at was doing. It was treating any of the elements acquired by using this metal heavy output or metal heavy input. It's treating any of the elements you acquire in that way as waste. But Pentapig's solution manages to treat them as something productive to the puzzle, while the first 3 inputs from this each become a smoke for the 5th input and only the 5th input. So the 5th smoke output uses a single fire and a single air coming from the waste outside of this puzzle and leaves the fire-air pair that is generated by this 6th input over here on the debonders because that's in a more advantageous position. That makes some sense. It's basically swapping out waste for waste, but the waste that you leave behind is in a better position to stay out of the way if the only goal is finishing the 6th output. Meanwhile, the copper which comes from this is passed off in a single cycle into this smallest chamber, and the purification process for this becomes gold very cleanly. Oh, because it is aided by the silver. So it drops off 2 coppers and 1 silver to become a gold. That's reasonable. And so then it does the swappy action right here. A lesser known thing, in case you didn't know, if you drop on 2 corresponding ends of a conduit, the atoms swap without colliding. There may have been other solutions so far to use that, but this is the first one that I am able to point out exactly where that is happening. So right here, Arm 10 drops a silver as Arm 6 drops a gold, and now Arm 10 has the gold and passes it over here where it is output. So it has to be creating 2 gold, right? There's the first gold, another swap, and there's the second gold. Dropped here on 48, while the final gold from the 4th of these inputs is dropped on 50. Meanwhile, on the smoke side, this process is by Arm 1, happens every 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 cycles. So in theory, you should be able to create all of the outputs of smoke by cycle 50, which is what happens. But just for the convenience of waste handling, you see Arm 3 here uses waste to finish it instead of using this air pair. And I'm wondering if that is because it saves a cycle. This drops on 12. If you were to add 8 at a time, you would be dropping the last one on 52. So yeah, it apparently saves 2 cycles to use. Oh yeah, because it avoids the step of needing to go to this duplication glyph, doesn't it? No, it still does. So it pivots, there's a gap cycle. There's 2 gap cycles. So on the one that doesn't have any slowdown, it goes up, down, down, drop. Perfect. Okay, so the slowdown is that it's able to use the waste for duplication in general, but then it takes another 2 cycles to position it here, and it avoids having to use those 2 cycles by having an air and fire coming from this and this come in and swing in to save the 2 cycles at the end, make it from a 52, which would have been the case if it was using the same pipeline it did for the first 5 smoke, and turn it into a 50 to get it in sync with the final drop of the metal. So once again, Pentapig is showing us how it's done, and winning this category in 50 cycles strides ahead of everyone else. Very big congratulations to Pentapig, and congratulations to everyone who solved this for cycles, because this is a rather nightmarish puzzle to try to cram all of the inputs in and figure out what you can and cannot do with the space. And now we move on to instructions. So instructions we saw briefly in week 3 in the context of a free space instructions with a cost sum. But in the production puzzles, it's meaningful to do a pure instructions optimization because you're not giving yourself infinite space to work with. You can't create a track loop that just grab, shift, drop until the puzzle is complete. So, for instructions, there are some very meaningful changes that you have to take in your approach to the puzzle. I will skip over solutions from chickens in the attic, and because that was mostly just the cycle solution we looked at earlier. But I do believe, starting with SGS, that is an actual cycles or an actual instructions solution. So here is a 104 instructions submission from SGS. Seems to be using a similar intention to the cycles submission, but with, let's see, does ARM7, yeah, ARM7 will always be doing this spin, spin, spin. That's nice. So every 2 times that ARM7 acts, the first time it doesn't really do much, and then the second time it's able to actually purify some things. Because there's no purification to be done if you just have an iron and a silver, but the second time you're able to do something meaningful. So that's good. This is showing a period halving of effect, because every 2 times that ARM7 acts, the conditions on this output are different. And so ARM10 is grabbing either a gold and a copper or nothing. And that works. ARM11 over here is doing a single rotation, but there's nothing able to grab this. So ARM11 is handling waste. As we saw in the cycle solutions from, I think it was Brother Mojo, it's possible to handle waste using a 6-arm without it preventing you from, or without it meaning you have to type out an entire instruction tape until the solution says you're complete. But it's just generally slightly harder. And it eventually will crash because this arm will run out of space for you to store waste on. But in terms of instructions optimization, per time it grabs, or per instruction period, it is consuming an entire one of these inputs and an entire one of these inputs. It is reaching a halfway point on purifying this and this, and it is creating an entire gold from this. There's still quite a lot of arms working, and there's still quite a lot of work being done by those arms. So the instruction count is still high at 104, but it's not like a standard metric where you can look at something, say it's high, and then see exactly where you cut away. For instructions, I think you more or less have to build the product and build a solution and then optimize it from there. Maybe people who have better intuition than me can find a way to look at a solution and say, yes, I can save 2 instructions right here without a giant redesign. But it's difficult. All right, the next instruction solution at 56 starts to get into the range of more instruction optimized approaches. And so as it turns out, and this is going to be a rather common trend, this input is the goal for a lot of instructions solutions. It's able to produce one of these, which despite having some symmetry to it, it doesn't really permit you to do part of the work. It's generally easiest to do all of the work to create one of these in one instruction tape. And then you can do partial work for the purification. The purification will As you can see in Sevier's solution, it just kind of advances in a binary way. First checking if it's made of silver. If it hasn't, then it moves the copper to this side. If it has made of gold here, then it drops that. If it hasn't, then it moves the silver to this side. And so every time that this loops, it kind of advances the binary counter all the way up until the fourth time it's gold. And also, it looks like Sevier was able to cut some instructions by having everything, by avoiding grabbing this. So the only time material is added to the board is when ARM1 is in this position, and every second instruction tape it stops in this position. If no material is added to the board, nothing's being grabbed that'll cause collisions. So this is the actual meaningful work, and then that atom is taken away. This time, nothing happens until the ARM1 gets back to the start. So that does save. It saves two instructions. If I were to add those two instructions back in, I'm sure the solution would still function, but it would just take an extra two instructions. So here's a place where I can actually say, like, oh yeah, this might have been this starting point, and then someone realizes, oh, it can be twice as slow, but save two instructions, and it's still valid because nothing's being grabbed. So that's a good optimization to have noticed. And it does have the speed of the solution, but the instructions, well, cost is the secondary and cycles is the tertiary. So unless you were feeling like you had to compete with somebody who was exactly at your instruction count and exactly at your cost, then how long it takes your solution to run for this category does not matter. It should be a bit of a relief after having the second, or after having the first category be all about squeezing all the time you can out and anxiety-inducing tessellation problems. Here it's just, what is the smallest amount of work you can have the arms have to do? And if the arm doesn't have to reset, just let the second time it goes through, take care of that for it. That's advantageous. Up next, we have Shadow Cluster with 55 instructions. And Shadow Cluster chose to use this input and chose to use a very large number of instruction tapes per output. I believe he told me it was 20 times through the instruction tape loop between making a single output. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so it takes 5 instruction tape loops to fully decompose this input, and then it'll take 4 times that to be able to turn the single error you get each time into actually this entire smoke output. And I think the real struggle that comes from this approach is the fact that there's a lot of logic being done to build this from conditional logic. We saw in Sevier's approach, building it every time that all the material is ready, just with write down all the instructions, that's all you need, tends to save some effort. But we'll see what happens here. So it's always going to be an error that becomes available. An ARM5 with its 5 length track will grab it on the correct cycle, always turn it into salt. ARM8 will always turn it into fire. Oh, but if it turns it into fire and it isn't already salt, then nothing happens. And it turns this one into air. Okay, so it's able to create a salt-fire pair using effectively conditional logic on whether or not this is salt or fire that it's grabbing. When I say salt-fire pair, I meant air-fire pair. And then ARM7 is using conditional logic with respect to, does the output accept this, to allow anything placed on this side of the bonder to be grabbed as soon as it's ready. So there's a lot of steps being taken, which adds instructions, but the actual method is very clean. Meanwhile, let's see how many instructions are being spent up in this top corner. Okay, so it's a conditional check here for is what I just made gold. If it isn't gold, then it has an opportunity to purify again. So silver is still not gold. Gold is gold, but next time it's up, it's copper. It's still not gold, so ARM1 will drop it. So this is 6 for ARM1 and 3 for ARM2. A 9 instruction chain to take copper, copper, silver deposited here and turn it into gold is not bad. It still could not. It's still not going to be what we see at the highest level, but this is a very good solution in terms of its purification. Most of the lost time is the fact that there needs to be so many pieces of machinery, each doing a small amount of work just to be able to get this constructed out of conditional logic from the every 20 feet of the input. So that's a little unfortunate for this solution, but at 55 instructions, it is the next best. We'll move on to Hutobi. What ratio, question mark? Yeah, Hutobi chose to use this input, which works, but it means that a lot of purification has to happen. So let's see how it works. So I'll admit, my first instructions attempt at this puzzle was in the 60s, and it used this input. But then I realized that I could use this one, and it was fast. It was much lower. Well, actually, not much lower. It's still the next one we're going to look at, which is unfortunate. But anyway, Hutobi's solution produces one air fire pair every time it grabs the input, thanks to the use of this Van Berlo's wheel. And arm 1 already advancing by 1 will help finish off the pair and put them both in the same chamber. And there's a bit of conditional. Oh, that's actually really nice. It'll reset it in a way such that arm 7 finishes the product, and then it gets to just do a conditional check on the output. Okay, yeah, so the assembly of the smoke here is pretty instruction efficient. The reason that it still has a lot of work to do is the fact that this whole purification pipeline. Let's see, arm 4 has four instructions. Arm 5 has actually a ton of instructions here. Fortunately, arm 6 and arm 3 only have 3 instructions, so it's not as bad, but arm 5 has to carry quite a lot of weight in terms of instructions, and that puts us at 50. Still, I really like this approach. It's much better than mine, which used this input, and this input is kind of hard to use because you have to do quite a lot of purification. Let's see what the next one looks like. Well, the next one would be mine at 42, which I was happy with, and that's why I didn't bother improving it further. I use this input for catalyst, like some of the others, and then the arm that grabbed it shrinks out of the way so that it no longer grabs anything and is not disruptive to the solution. And then once the catalyst is in place, it's easy for the rest of the arms to produce one smoke per tape loop, and then pass the copper on to 12 instructions to turn copper into gold. But it's a steady copper feed. What I think is kind of neat about this solution is that it fills this tri-arm with silver, and then those silvers pair up with the ones that come 3 later to become gold. I saw quite a few 12 instruction motifs in these 2 chambers among the instruction solutions to turn copper into gold for people who chose to use this input only. 12 wasn't as good as it gets, in fact. There's actually a way that this solution might be able to be improved. I don't know if it's specific to the instruction period that Pentapig used, but you can use copper and get gold more instruction efficient than 12 on the left, but that's some more deep tech. I was happy enough to hit 42 and I wasn't going to make modifications. Yeah, this is an approach that we'll see pretty soon from quite a few people of one of these inputs, create one of the smokes, pass the copper along. Up next we have Rolomni. 40 instructions. Also using this little elbow-shaped input, which means there's a lot of work to be done in purification, but also one instruction loop is going to grab this and rotate it once. So there are 3 instruction tapes even before it starts to disassemble the second input. And that means that almost everything done in this solution has to be conditional logic, because there's not really a good way to be period-based. Now, ARM 2 is period-based. ARM 2 is going to every third cycle, or every third instruction loop. It's going to grab this and pass it on through this conduit so that it can start doing this purification chain. The purification chain works entirely on conditional logic, similar to the way that we saw shadow clusters do it. That's actually very fascinating. So everything will match. So there, basically, if you look at the grabbers of this ARM5 Mod 3, one of them will always grab, one of the congruence classes will always grab iron, one of them will always grab copper, and one of them will always grab silver. It's a rotating storage wheel that is basically putting things in their modular congruence class, which is, it's great because it also means that when something doesn't pass the output check on gold, it's able to pair up with its other modular congruence piece. So now we're holding 2 silvers as we go along the merry-go-round. Every time we take the iron off, we put in a copper. Here it is at its fullest. And now the next iron we get will have copper and silver available to it, and it'll be able to consume all that material and make gold. This is a brilliant little motif. This solves the problem of using this input extremely elegantly because you have one conditional loop here that'll take iron and it'll ultimately make gold without any necessary changes being made for whether it's handling copper or whether it's handling silver. It's just based on the position around this grabber and the amount of cycles that it has spent turning. So that's really cool. And so with that, we just have to figure out what the fire is doing. ARM6 is using another every third time it grabs, it's going to be in the specific position. I dropped it in a different angle than it came in. So the second fire that comes through is aligned for ARM6 to grab it, which prevents it from doing what ARM7 is doing, which would turn it into air through the Burroughs wheel. And we have two arms on tracks that are just grab, advance, drop. This is the boring instructions motif that's grab, advance, drop, but it's only boring if it does the entire problem for you. And it's also not that boring. Volomny has shown that it's like extremely deep theory, but it's the reason that instructions puzzles are trivial if you do them in free space. Fortunately, because we're in confined space, you can only use these sort of things for portions of the work, which means you still have to solve other portions of the work and add more instructions and be slightly non-trivial, and that's really cool. So I think the reason that this isn't lower instructions is just based on the sheer number of arms. Every arm that is doing something has to take at least 3 instructions to do that thing. So despite having a really great utilization instruction count per arm, the number of arms is slowing this one to 40 instructions, which is not that well placed on the leaderboards, actually. Matter Monkey with 40 instructions as well has quite a lot more work per arm 1, for example, but the number of arms is much lower. It's only 6 arms for this entire solution. Doing something similar to what we saw Sivir doing, of the number of rotates on this desyncs it. So actually, yeah, it takes 3 times for arm 1 acting in order for it to grab this input again. And as we saw with Sivir, when it doesn't grab anything, there's no collisions being caused because there's only this one input. If it's not being grabbed, there's just kind of arms swinging around doing nothing. But that doesn't add anything other than cycles, which is of least importance. And then there's conditional logic going on here to advance this copper to gold, which isn't the most elegant form of this conditional logic, but it's made up for by the fact that the smoke is handled so much more quickly. Arm 2 just has to grab the fire salt pairs, which are they duplicate themselves, and that's really convenient. And I want to look a little bit more closely at how it duplicates itself. So by the position of the unbonding glyph, by the time it's here, this gets the chance to rotate one more time before this is grabbed, causing the fires to meet up. And so you have air fire come through the first time and fire air the second. Arm 3 does a conditional check. If it doesn't pass, then it gets rotated into place so that it passes the second time. So yeah, 40 instructions. This is very elegant handling for the smoke, slightly inelegant for the purification, but we get to see the better ones handle that problem better. So that was 40. Mr. Puzzle, the production cabinet enthusiast, is up next with 39. One instruction tape will halfway disassemble this input. The halfway point is the same except for that the fire has been replaced with salt and the top half is gone. And because it drops here, if it's a single atom, it'll be grabbed by the conduit. If it isn't a single atom, it'll allow it to come right back to the input. So there's a good conditional logic check here to prevent it from having copper that it can't handle. And eventually when the copper is grabbed on this conduit, it will go through the 12 cycle. Let's see, I want to be sure that it's 12 cycle before I say things. Yeah, this is 5, 6, 7, and 8, each with 3 cycles to turn copper into gold in some purification, then teleport, then purification again way. It isn't identical to mine. It's meeting up with something which comes from a different number of cycles away, but it is functional. Interestingly, the layout that Mr. Puzzle chose to use allowed him to use the Van Berlo's wheel for the catalyst instead of having to spend an arm grabbing the second input, so that's a significant improvement over mine. The conditional logic from ARM 3 to assemble the half inputs into the full output perhaps costs the solution a little bit, but it's elegant in the terms of using fewer instruction because it manages to use 2 periods per output for the smoke. And in general, I would say that using more periods per output is better, but there's clearly a way in which it comes back to bite you, like we saw earlier with Shadow Cluster. Up next, we have Hutobi. The instruction submission... No, we don't have Hutobi next. I was looking at the wrong part of this. Up next, we have Fyandir. 38 instructions. So this is a solution that chooses to use the Y-shaped input and a lot of arms. How does this manage to be 38 instructions? This is fascinating. So it's 3 tape loops per input. It's using the fact that when you create a purification output, if you put it into the left part of the purifier, it's going to match reasonably well with anything here. But if it's gold, then it just passes along. So yeah, this tiny top portion of here is all that is devoted to handling metals, and it does so very instruction efficiently. But then all of the rest of this machinery is devoted to handling the smoke output. And that's what you get when you place this input, is a lot of work to be able to turn the single air with 3 bonds on it into this output. So let's see what we have here. Everything that goes through this chamber will turn into fire. Depending on the angle of arm 4, oh no, it's still just trying to match the every third instruction tape, it's the input. So arm 4 is going to not turn every single air into fire based on the bonder. So if there is a fire already, then arm 4 bonds to it and it doesn't drop into the conduit, which allows arm 7 and 8 to start the process of turning it into an actual output. So that's interesting. Arm 7 is also using the fact that it's desynced depending on the final position to only act every 6th time that there's an atom here. But it takes 12 runs of the instruction tape to create the smoke output. So 7 does act twice. The first time it is taking this bonded pair, pivoting and getting it over here, where arm 8 will then just always force it into this position. So arms 7 and 8 are kind of a pair that exists to get this sitting on the bonder in this direction, which causes the second time arm 7 swings by to cause it to be a valid output. But that's a good number of instructions, 10 here, that are devoted just to taking what's almost the smoke output and making it into the smoke output. So I do think still that using this input cost finder quite a few instructions just because the smoke is very difficult to produce. Yep. Let's go next to Brother Mojo. 37 instructions, but using this input, which I do think is the correct input to be using. And doing similar to what we saw Mr. Puzzle do of half disassembling such that the fire is replaced with salt. So that it takes 2 instruction periods to grab the input. Meanwhile, there's a purification wheel going on in the tiny chamber, which eventually creates a silver. And that silver is dropped as conditional logic on here. Eventually, it will cause there to be a gold, which Arm 2 handles en route to delivering these fire airs to this. When is the duplication happening? The duplication is happening, and that's the reason that this conduit isn't here. Duplication is happening during the time that Arm 2 is spending delivering them, which is nice. And a 6 arm with 3 instructions is able to just keep a lot of things moving and do a lot of work without adding to the instruction count of the solution. So yeah, this is very good handling for the smoke. This is taking 7 cycles or 7 instructions in this chamber. Arm 2 has a lot of purposes. It does the duplication, it drops things on the conduit, and it delivers the gold. So this is the most effective 3 instructions in the entire solution by a long shot. And it manages to cut it to 2 inputs, or 2 instruction tapes per input. There we go. Sorry, I'm stumbling over words a little bit. I haven't talked in a while. Quarantine will do that to you. Anyway, onward. Tweedledee with 36 instructions is the next one to look at. This looks like one of the 12 cycle motifs in this, although Arm 7 is a single arm, so it might have to reset. Yeah, Arm 7 is doing 2, so this has 13 instructions in these 2 chambers for the purification chain. But as we see, programming all the way through to the end, 1 instruction tape makes 1 smoke, actually did very well for this solution. It's kind of a trade-off of, are you going to be adding more instructions trying to accommodate the fact that you chose to use 2 tapes per input than you would be just using a tape per input? And through whatever mechanism Tweedledee made this decision, using a single tape per input and getting 36 instructions out of it was a very good outcome. It helps that the position in which they're removing the 2 pieces is very conducive to making this output without lots of instructions spent, just some slides and some pivots. So yeah, 36 instructions. This is an exemplary use of this input. And we have to see what comes next now, because 36 is by no means the winner. Peen Locket with 34 instructions. So this is a 12 instruction motif over here, like it has been for a lot of the others. There's the 6 arm. A 6 arm and Van Berlo's wheel on a track. So it isn't duplicating off of the other fire. It's duplicating off of Van Berlo's wheel. So the 6 arm is beneficial in that it gets to deliver the copper and deliver the smoke. And there's not any special handling that needs to be taken to move from the debonder onto the bonder, because the way it is debonded already puts it in position for bonding it again. That's part of the nice things about having molecules composed of more than 1 atom, is if you debond in one place, the other end of it can still be on a bonder and already be in position, preventing you from needing any extra special handling. So I think just utilizing convenience of what's already there was able to cut this one down to 34 instructions. It's fascinating to me that the Van Berlo's wheel on a track was the best way of handling duplication, but I guess when you're planning to use the bonder connected to the debonder like this, there's not extra time to spend doing any duplication. Let's watch the rotary phone style work of these copper and silver production. One, Yes, very cool solution by Locket. And I happened to see a lot of Locket's iterations that had a completely different approach to this. Locket had famously put on the Reddit a clockwork style purified gold that was able to use one arm's instructions to advance in the same binary counting way that we saw in a previous solution, but it's all being done by a single 6-arm. So a single 6-arm is able to count up in binary effectively all the way to gold with only one instruction tape, not even adding other arms doing any work. So Locket had an initial submission that had something very much resembling that to handle the purification before realizing that putting purification in these two chambers allowed this input to be used, and this input being used allowed a lot faster smoke assembly and fewer instructions. But the entire iteration cycle for Locket's submissions exists in some Imgur album somewhere that was shared on the Discord. If people want to look at that, there's a lot of very good insights from it. Up next, Alerka. Now she had a slightly cheaper 34 instruction solution than Locket's, so that wins her another place. I think this is now the 4th place solution, yeah. And it is using this input, but significantly more instruction loops per grab. You can see arm 1 here is push, pivot, drop, and the end result is that it does the same half disassembly of this input every 3 times, so it takes 6 routes through here to fully disassemble this input, which means that it takes 6 instruction tapes to build smoke and 24 instruction tapes to build gold. So the gold is almost certainly at conditional logic. Now, arm 3 is using a single advance on a track, which means that the every 6 inputs that the every 6 tapes that it spends building this, one of them will get acted on by arm 3. Let's see what arm 3 is devoted to. Arm 2 is able to act twice in 6 cycles, which is... So yeah, that makes sense. Arm 2 is going to handle the fire and salt pair, or fire and air pair. And because it's on a track of length 3, when it runs 6 times, it'll handle 2 things. That's this pair and this pair. Those are the 2 things. Arm 3 on a track of length 6 will only handle 1 thing, but that thing is the copper, which makes sense because there's only 1 of it in the input. It's nice that this layout allows for the duplication to happen without adding any extra instructions. So what's left is arm 4 doing a pretty lengthy conditional operation to allow, no matter when this fire is coming in, this fire-air pair, to assemble the smoke output cleanly. We'll see what she's doing over in this top right corner. This is where all the purification happens. Managing to do it in only 4 plus 4 plus 3, 11 instructions to get all the way from copper to gold. I know that she had analyzed her solution somewhere on the Discord about how arm 6 serves to treat this as a 5 grabber arm instead of a 6 grabber arm by taking anything that is dropped at this point and moving it forwards by 1. Does it? Yes, it also matches its grabs and drops to arm 5's drops and grabs to prevent anything from passing backwards through the conduit. So you can see that arm 6 is holding on to this instead of dropping it to prevent it from arriving in the conduit. That way when it drops, arm 5 grabs again, nothing is passed through the conduit by being unheld. All right, so that allows this to be a circuit of length 5, which means when things are dropped 6 tape loops apart, they arrive in adjacent grabbers. And when things are in adjacent grabbers, they work with purification. So this is a brilliant choice. This is a brilliant way of allowing for the gold to be output. This is very good work. I now better understand what she was saying in Discord. So yeah, I like this purification approach. It's very elegant, and then the every 6 inputs allow some modular work on these tracks. Arm 4 is still taking quite a few instructions to assemble the smoke, but that feels necessary given this approach. I don't know whether Arm 4, without changing a few facets of the solution, would be able to improve. But Let's move onwards and see what other people have made. We got Lars Dahl at 33 instructions. So 33 instructions and the same 12 instruction motif in these two left. How does it manage to save so much? So similar to what we saw Tweedledee do, it's one instruction loop fully disassembles this input, which prevents the smoke from needing a lot of conditional logic. ARM 2 with only 6 instructions and ARM 3 with only 3 instructions means that ARM 1 is in a position to do, okay, cool, yeah, it's bonding before it finishes debonding this copper from the 2. Yeah, that's very efficient. I mean, there has to be some amount of rearranging going on, even if you're using the right input, which I consider this the right input. Has to be some amount of rearranging going on to be able to make the smoke. And I feel like the way that it is being done, with things still bonded together, saves you from needing new arms grabbing new things. And I'd say this is a very good approach. And at 33 instructions, it is obviously good. The 12 instructions for copper to gold. Like, Alaric has shown that 11 instructions for copper to gold, also fitting in only this chamber, is completely possible and valid. So I see no reason why you can't copy the logic she put in this chamber into one of these and save one cycle on all of these that are using the, or not one cycle, save one instruction on all of these that are using this 12 instruction motif. But it did rely actually on there being some divisor of 6 and how much distance was between the two. But these are all using either 1 or 2 or 3 or 6 instruction loops per period, and I think as long as it is a divisor of 6, it should work. Maybe it'll run into some problem somewhere down the line. It's hard to know without trying it out, and I'm not building during this, I'm just talking about other people's solutions. But with Lars Dahl's approach, 33 instructions, this is a very good solution. This got 3rd place. Next, we will look at Jin Yu with 31 instructions. Jin Yu, once again, choosing to place all of the inputs on the board for completeness' sake. The only one that's being truly used is here, although we can see ARM 2 grab pull is going to use the elbow-shaped one as a catalyst, similar to one of the first cycle solutions that we saw. But one instruction loop is being devoted to the complete disassembly of this input. So this, as we saw with Lars Dahl, is finding that the best option is to spend one entire instruction tape disassembling this and creating smoke so that you don't have to waste time with conditional logic. And then just passing the copper along to this pass-off. So the use of a catalyst adds only 2 instructions in total and prevents you needing any maneuvering to get these two, to get the fire next to the one that became salt. So that's pretty convenient, and this just kind of requires that you make space for it, but there was clearly ample space. I mean, the other 2 inputs both fit. So yeah, Jin Yu at 31 instructions has solved the problems of duplication far better than the solutions that we've seen before it, and that saves him 2 instructions on Lars Dahl, and this gets him 2nd place. But once again, our winner is Pentapig, and we saw 33, we saw 31. I wasn't quite prepared for how much lower it got. 26 instructions here by Pentapig. Like, what we're looking at here in front of us, this entire instruction tape, this is the solution. So how does it work? ARM 3 has a single rotate per its period. So this is going to take 6, it's going to take 6 passes through the instruction tape before it is able to grab another one of these inputs. But like we saw in Lars Dahl's and Jin Yu's, it only needs to happen once for the smoke output. ARM 4 is entirely responsible for creating the smoke output, and the reason that it isn't dropping it more often is similar to what we saw in some of the other solutions, just the fact that ARM 3 isn't grabbing anything. So then it becomes a question of how is Pentapig improving on the 12 cycle motif for turning copper into gold? Because what we, or 12 instructions. What we see over here is 10. And it works whenever there's one being dropped every 6. So the copper being dropped here is happening every 6th instruction tape. During that time, arm 1 will move something 1 against the grain on its track. So 1 against the grain here is copper onto here. Next time along, it'll move this copper down to here, so that the next one comes into duplication, and against the grain for the silver goes back into this duplication glyph, or goes back into the conduit. Now, because this is going to be producing silver every 12 loops, arm 2 has to move the silver twice between dropping it here and putting it on this, so it has to make 2 steps against its progression. Once that goes into this corner, and then the second time actually onto the other side of the purification glyph. So this 10 instruction approach could probably be adapted to work with instruction loop counts per output different than 6, but it worked extremely elegantly for 6 inputs or 6 instruction tapes per input, which goes very nicely with what we saw some of the earlier solutions do all the work and then just stop grabbing things. And when you're not grabbing things, it works. At 26 instructions, this is something to learn from. This is a very good solution. And it is the clear winner of the instructions category for this puzzle. So very good job, Pig. I think the principles that benefited a lot of the other solutions of handle the smoke with as little extra conditions and as few extra arms as you need is employed here, while still getting to use some of the other trickery of instruction tape multiplying per input on all the rest of it. So this is a very, very good solution. All right. And so once again, congratulations to everyone who participated in this week. This was a very hard week. Any of these production cabinet puzzles kind of change the way that Zachtronics, or the way that Opus Magnum in particular, feels. This game usually feels like, yes, I can do anything, I just need the space and maybe place down a lot of tracks, but if you give me a really, really hard puzzle, I will eventually be able to solve it. Production cabinet puzzles can go against that and make it feel like you don't have the space to solve it, especially when I'm giving you this much input. So everyone who made a solution to this puzzle should feel proud of themselves, but also particularly strong showing from Pentapig with 2 different category wins. This is a 20-point week. You can see what those points mean with regards to the tournament standings on the Reddit post. And yeah, I'll see you next time for week 6.